7 of those people lost their lives because the generators failed and they suffocated. I've been warning about blackouts potentially happening, but didn't think they'd be happening so soon. Trying to use inverter-based technologies on an alternating current grid is like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. Pigs flying is possible. There's a non-zero probability that pigs will fly. Doesn't make it likely.
Hello and welcome to the Free the Power podcast, the IEA's occasional series looking at free market solutions to energy challenges. I'm joined today by Kathryn Porter, a UK energy expert and independent consultant, and some would say the expert on UK energy issues. Kathryn, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we looked at to set this podcast up was the things you've been writing about, the Iberian Peninsula blackout. And this is something that occurred on April the 28th this year. And the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula, which is essentially Spain and Portugal, briefly went offline or had a power failure for 10 hours. And you looked into the reasons why, particularly in 2 very detailed and effective blog posts that you wrote in July. So maybe just to set the context, I mean, why does this matter? Why are blackouts a problem?
So the blackout that we saw in Iberia in April happened in what I'd call Goldilocks weather conditions. So it wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold, and yet 11 people lost their lives. One of those fatalities was related to the use of candles, and the other 10 were related to failures of generation equipment that was needed for medical equipment, and in particular respirators. 7 of those people lost their lives because the generators failed and they suffocated. And then the other 3, the generator didn't outright fail, but it gave off carbon monoxide. So not only did the person using the ventilator suffocate, so did 2 of their relatives. And so this kind of indicates the dangers with blackouts, that even in very benign weather conditions, they can very easily lead to fatalities. If we imagine similar blackout conditions in London early in December, and that the danger period there would be in the evening, well, at 5 o'clock in early December, you still have children coming home from school. You'd have no street lights, no traffic lights, no ambient light from buildings. All those stupid bollards in the road wouldn't be lit up. So you literally just have car headlights and people's mobile phones. So I think it's inevitable you'd have traffic accidents. You'd have people stuck in lifts and on trains, in buildings that are unheated. It could be quite cold at that time of year. You'd have elderly people falling in the home. It would be dangerous. And
the heating would fail as well, despite mostly being gas in the UK, wouldn't
Yes, it would, because they rely on electricity for the water to be pumped. And most boilers will go off, actually, if there's no electricity. So you would have no heating, you would have no lighting. And I actually advise people with elderly relatives to have them keep torches in different places around the house, particularly at the top and the bottom of the stairs, because that's obviously the most dangerous part of the house if you have any sort of mobility challenges, which is more common in the elderly, and just so that they're prepared in case that there is a blackout.
So Spain, to some extent, although not the poor 11 that unfortunately lost their lives, to some extent were lucky at the time of year that it happened.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, one thing that didn't happen, which you see in every Hollywood movie, is when the lights go out, immediately people start throwing bricks through windows of shops and looting. I mean, but this is not something that happened in Spain or Portugal.
It's not, but I think they mobilised the military quite quickly. The army and the police were deployed on the streets, both to manage traffic, which was obviously important because the traffic lights had all failed, but also they were actively bringing fuel to hospitals because they all had to use their generators that were running on diesel. So the military was used to make sure that those fuel supplies were maintained. And so there was actually quite a significant presence of authority, if you like, on the streets at that time.
So going back to what you wrote at the time, people should care a lot about this risk.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt that blackouts in the winter in Britain would be dangerous. And I think in summer, if Spain had had the blackouts in the middle of the summer when they have the heat, then that would have been very dangerous for them. they were lucky that it happened at a time of year when it was neither too hot nor too cold. But if you could think about being trapped in lifts and on trains in the middle of the summer with no air conditioning, then again, anybody with health vulnerabilities then would be at very high risk.
So going to some of the underlying causes of the problem. Now, what you did very effectively, both in the first part of your blog on this and also an explainer video, which will be in the show notes and I highly recommend people watch, is talk about the physics of the electricity system, which to most of us, I have to say, looks rather like magic. So is there a simple way of explaining how the grid works that's relevant to this topic?
Yes. Okay. So to put it in simple terms, our electricity grid operates using alternating current. And you typically generate alternating current by having one magnet rotating inside the magnetic field of another magnet. And this happens in our conventional power stations by putting magnets on the turbines. And basically these are rotating. And all of these turbines rotate at the same speed. Mm-hmm. So in Europe, that's 3,000 revolutions per minute. This is a slight simplification. There are scenarios where you have different speeds, but essentially it's always going to be multiples of 1,500. And you get this gives you the rate at which your current and voltage alternate in your alternating current, which is a very regular sine wave, and you get 50 cycles per second from your 3,000 revolutions per minute that your turbines, that's the rotation speed. So 3,000 divided by 60 is your 50 hertz. This 50 hertz, 50 cycles per second, is an extremely important property in our electricity grids. We call it frequency. And electrical equipment is really sensitive to this property. If frequency deviates by more than about 1%, then electrical equipment will have protection measures that engage to turn off the equipment so that it doesn't get damaged. Now, this frequency property is actually also connected with supply and demand. So you can think of it a little bit like water in a pipe. If you put more water into a pipe, then the pressure goes up. If you put more electricity into the grid than people are using, so generation is higher than demand, the frequency will increase. And then the opposite is true. And this tends to be the issue, that you have more demand than you have generation. The frequency falls, it goes below your safe levels, protection measures kick in, and everything turns itself off. And conventionally, this frequency measure has been the main way in which system operators have monitored the stability of the grid. Now, you have quite a problem when you start introducing intermittent renewables based on wind and sun, because they don't generate electricity in alternating current form at this 50 hertz regular nice pattern that you require. Solar doesn't generate alternating current at all. It generates direct current, which is where you just have a stable, flat output over time. And that has to be converted to alternating current using electronics. And wind, although you do have rotating parts, they're obviously not rotating at a constant rate because the wind doesn't blow at a constant rate. So often what they do is they convert the electricity to direct current and then convert it back into alternating current of the type that the grid expects. As you reduce the amount of conventional generation, the grid becomes weaker. You lose an important property called inertia. Because your conventional generators are big, heavy lumps of equipment, they resist changes to their speed of rotation. And so they put a drag on that change in frequency, which isn't the case with electronics. The electronics actually will observe the frequency and very quickly self-disconnect if it doesn't conform to their parameters. And in fact, that was quite an issue in Spain, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So as we introduce more renewables, we see the ability to maintain stable frequency becomes harder, and the costs of doing so increase. We call this balancing, and our balancing costs have been increasing by billions of pounds a year as we try and manage the impact of this basically the fact that gusts of wind and clouds can have really significant short-term output impacts. And so it's hard to maintain that balance between supply and demand in real time.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? Because these are big, heavy, spinny machines, but they're the wrong type of big, heavy, spinny machines. So they're not providing the inertia that the grid needs.
Exactly. Now, some people say, oh, well, you can use electronics that will help you deliver inertia synthetically with renewables. So far, nobody's come up with a solution to this. And the Australian system operator's been working on this for about 8 years now. The problem is that if you're going to use wind and solar to provide inertia, you effectively have to haircut your regular output. So you have to keep a little bit of your generating capacity in reserve. And there would obviously be a cost to that. Mm-hmm. But you get that inertia property for free from conventional generators. So far, nobody's really come up with a market framework to do this because nobody wants to pay for something that you were used to getting for free.
So when renewable advocates talk very excitedly about flywheels, for example, this is an expensive service you would not need unless we had renewables.
Yes, exactly. Flywheels are a very old technology. They're just lumps of spinning metal, but you need to buy them and pay for them and install them. They're not for free, whereas your gas, nuclear, hydro, coal, oil turbines, they just all do it for free automatically.
And Spain, I take it, didn't have many flywheels spinning at this time.
No, but so when I said that conventionally frequency has been the main measure of stability in the grid, what Spain showed us is that actually we also need to care about voltage. That as you move more to a low inertia condition with more renewables, voltage control starts to become more significant. And the problem in Spain actually originated with a voltage disturbance, not a frequency disturbance.
So what does that mean? So what happened?
Right. So they traced the original problem to a solar inverter. So inverters are those electronics that convert the direct current to alternating current. And they don't know why it malfunctioned, but it malfunctioned. And it created a voltage oscillation. So the voltage, instead of being just alternating at the 50 hertz, there was a secondary oscillation within that, so that it was moving at 50 hertz and then moving, and then the voltage was also moving differently. So this and the malfunction which caused that voltage oscillation also caused a frequency oscillation. Now, if you read the Red Eléctrica de España report on this, so it wasn't written by a native English speaker. And so they make statements like the voltage oscillation caused a frequency oscillation. So that's not really correct. Mm-hmm. They don't cause each other. It's a little bit like saying, well, sunshine causes plants to grow and gives people sunburn, but plants growing doesn't give people sunburn. So they share the same cause, but they're not causing each other to happen. So
two bad things happen, at least two bad things.
Correct, yes. Yeah. Now, one of the tools that system operators use to control voltage is called reactive power. And all generators, whether they're conventional or renewable, are supposed to provide some form of reactive power. And what we saw in Spain was really three problems arose. The first one was that Red Eléctrica simply didn't schedule enough reactive power resources from conventional generators. Mm-hmm. The second was that quite a lot of the conventional generators didn't meet their reactive power obligations under the Spanish grid code. And also the renewable generators didn't meet their power angle obligations, which is related under the grid code. So there was widespread non-compliance under the grid code of both conventional and renewable generation, plus a failure to even schedule enough in the first place.
I mean, anyone familiar with Mediterranean countries and their attention to complying with the law would not be shocked by that.
No, but we have similar compliance issues here in Britain, so I wouldn't be too complacent about that. And the problem is this is not monitored. So here in Britain, your grid code compliance is tested when you originally connect to the grid, but then that's it. If subsequently something happens and you're found to have been non-compliant, you get fined, but there's no ongoing monitoring of compliance. Now, as we move more to inverter-based technologies, wind, solar and batteries, that actually becomes quite a big problem because there are excuse me, the compliance issues are more profound with inverters than they are with conventional generation. So we had this issue with lack of compliance around the voltage control measures within Spain. Simultaneously, because this was in the middle of the day and it was very sunny, quite a few solar generators turned themselves off because prices went negative. Now, these were connected to the low voltage distribution networks. So the way that manifests on the transmission system was effectively an increase in demand. Basically, instead of the demand being met locally by solar, now it was having to be met at the national level through the transmission system. And the system operator had no notice of this. 1 minute demand was at one level, the next minute there was a step change of a few hundred megawatts, which is significant.
So what was tripping the solar farms off was...
Well, they weren't tripping. They were deciding to...
Yeah, so they had a piece of code that when the price went below zero meant they stopped producing.
Exactly, it was an economic choice. So, of course, this created a reduction in demand and a frequency deviation, because when demand and supply are out of balance and you have more demand than generation, the frequency falls. So then what we saw was quite a lot of renewable generators in response to the reduction in frequency began to trip off. And they started to trip off within the range where they should still operate. And of course, when they tripped off, you then saw a bigger reduction in frequency. And then that reduction in frequency was large enough that the system parameters did fall outside the normal limits, and conventional generators began to trip off. So the initial trips by renewable generators were another compliance failure of the grid code. The conventional generators tripping off wasn't a compliance failure because they didn't trip until the system had gone outside the normal operating parameters that they're expected to ride through. And so quite quickly, once that started to happen, you ended up with a cascading failure that at that point you really couldn't recover. Too many things are disconnected. The interconnectors disconnected, the nuclear power stations disconnected, the hydro disconnected, everything just disconnected. Frequency went to zero, voltage went to zero, and the lights went off.
So all the fail-safe systems encouraged failure in order to protect the assets from damage from the cascade.
Yes, and you want that to happen because otherwise they would break and then they'd be out of action for a lot more than 10 hours.
So I guess what most people don't understand about this is why somebody then couldn't just simply flick a switch and it all comes back on again and everybody's happy.
Well, okay, so this is actually quite an interesting topic. What they had to do was called a full black start. Now, we've actually never done one of these in Britain, and it's quite complicated. So when I said earlier that we have all the conventional generators rotating at the same speed, they obviously don't just have to rotate at the same speed, but they have to rotate in line with each other. So when they produce their wave of current and voltage, you need all the peaks and all the troughs to line up. You don't want them cancelling each other out. And the other issue is that not every... So it's a bit like when you try and start your car, the car engine doesn't directly start to begin with. You have a starter motor. The power stations require the same thing. The way that you set up, you know, when I said one magnet rotating inside another magnet's magnetic fields, these are electromagnets. You require current in order to create those magnetic fields. So where does the current come from if you're in a full blackout? You need to have an input source of power. But if there's a blackout, where's that coming from? So you have some power stations that have what we call black start capability. And typically that would be an on-site diesel generator. You can also use hydro for this if you have some sort of mechanical way of opening your water valves to let the water start dropping through. But conventionally, you need to have some backup, a generator of some sort that will give you the power that you need to start up your first generators. So what happens is that ahead of time, all system operators have plans for this. You identify which your black start power stations are within each part of your grid. and you will start up that black start power station, and then they'll start their turbines running. It'll take a bit of time to get them up to speed, and then they will energize the grid in their local area so that the next power station can take electricity to start its own turbines going. And then they'll start their turbines and then they'll synchronize to each other so that the peaks and troughs of their current and voltage line up with each other. So then you've got 2 power stations, and then you keep adding more power stations. Now, when I said the point about supply and demand have to be in balance, you've got no demand at this point. So what you actually do is you make sure your current and voltage are perfectly lined up together. And that means that you don't actually have generation on the grid. So you slightly unphase them to get the next power station to start up. But once it's running, you phase them back together. Because if you then had generation and no demand, everything would turn itself off again. So this is actually a pretty complicated engineering challenge to do.
I think the description, it's a bit like magic, is sounding more accurate now.
Well, exactly. And so you will gradually start building up this, you could call it electrical potential, that you have all these power stations now ready to generate electricity, but they're not actually generating electricity because you've manipulated the current and the voltage in a way that prevents that. And then you will gradually synchronize these different islands, because basically you set up all these little islands, you synchronize them together, and then you start adding in load. And then, so you gradually start connecting demand, you open up your phase angle, and you carefully bring everything up and keep controlling that frequency to make sure that you do that in a stable way. And it's a pretty complicated process, and it takes time. And if you don't do it correctly, there's a big risk that you'll damage equipment. So you really do need to take it carefully. You can't just flick a switch.
So 5 seconds to fail, but then 10 hours of extreme caution and skill.
Yeah.
To restabilize the system.
Yeah, and the trouble is, if you don't do it carefully, then you can break stuff, and then it can be months before it's restored. So it makes more sense just to take your time. If it takes a few hours longer than you'd hoped, that's much better than having an incomplete grid for weeks and months.
Which would lead to a Hollywood-style situation.
Well, I mean, I think there'd be ways of avoiding that, but you'd end up in a scenario where you might have to do demand control in some places, or you might have to spend a lot more money on controlling the stability of the grid. You might have to bring up assets that you wouldn't normally use at that time of year. They had quite a lot of stuff off on maintenance at that time, both hydro and nuclear. So you'd be maybe paying people to come back early off maintenance to replace assets that had got damaged and so on. So, I mean, you just want to
it would not be a good year for that particular government, I think would be fairly safe to say.
No, or for the system operator. So, slow and steady.
Avoiding the problem in the first place. So just to clarify.
Well, avoiding the problem in the first place. Red Electrica a few weeks earlier had boasted that it ran its grid 100% intermittent renewables for a very brief period of time, and was really taking liberties with inertia. And when the blackout happened, there were immediate announcements to the effect that, well, we know how to prevent this happening again, which is true. They just used a lot more gas. And they did. If you look at the generation mix before and after the blackouts, they did increase their gas utilisation quite significantly. So even though they didn't, I think, appreciate the full effects of the voltage issue, they certainly kept a better handle on inertia. And there's no coincidence, I think, that when the fault propagated into France, it was very quickly contained, because France has a very high inertia grid. Although it's very low carbon, it's relying on nuclear and hydro, which are conventional generators. They work using the same spinning machines that gas generators use. So the fault really didn't propagate in France. But what was interesting as well from the report from Red Electrica was that they'd also identified some ongoing frequency anomalies on the grid, or frequency oscillations. In fact, they didn't call them anomalies, they called them normal 0.2 hertz oscillations that are normal on the European grid. But just because something's normal doesn't mean it's good. It's normal for cyclists to cycle on the pavement here in London. It doesn't make it less illegal or dangerous or annoying, frankly. And so there's a thing called normalization of deviance that was made famous after the Challenger disaster. NASA had been sending these rockets up into space knowing that the O-rings were defective, but they felt that that defect was somehow all right, that it wasn't going to cause a huge problem. And then obviously it did cause a huge problem. And so I would really question whether they're not falling into the same trap, the European system operators, allowing these frequency oscillations to take place when they don't really have a solid understanding of why they're happening, and they're not seemingly able to prevent them from happening. And then when you add on some other types of oscillations that are caused by ad hoc malfunctions of equipment, and there can be other types of malfunctions. So in this case, it was an inverter that malfunctioned and started creating strange effects on the grid. But you could have something very mundane like a lightning strike, and that would have also caused disturbances. So disturbances are likely to happen anyway. It's if you start adding multiple disturbances on top of each other, you're not necessarily going to understand how to manage it. And one of the problems we saw in Spain was that the system operator was using effectively static voltage management strategies to manage what was a very dynamic situation.
Which they didn't fully understand. And they were speculating about cyber attacks, terrorism, freak weather events.
Well, so you can say that you don't understand the origin of a disturbance. That's fair enough, because it might take some time to work that out. Some will be obvious straight away. If there's a lightning strike, you pretty much know that immediately. But other things might take you longer to get to the bottom of. You'll probably be able to isolate where on the grid it happened pretty quickly, but not necessarily exactly which component was responsible. But nevertheless, you do know the consequence of it straight away. They saw the 0.6 hertz oscillation straight away. They didn't need to know why it was happening. They needed to know what to do about it.
So this relates to the faulty inverter of solar farm, is that right?
Yes.
And then the cascade of problems that followed included other renewable assets and then some conventional assets turning themselves off in response to the changes.
Yeah, so you had the faulty inverter creating these oscillations. You also had the market-driven disconnection of solar because of just the prices going negative. You had a failure to respond to the voltage control instructions that they were receiving from the grid operator. The grid operator itself hadn't scheduled enough of this anyway. But the really big problem was the non-compliance of renewable generation when it came to the frequency deviation, because the frequencies started to fall, but it was still within the range that should have been okay, and renewables started to trip off. So if they'd been compliant with their fault ride-through obligations, if they'd stayed on the way the conventional generation stayed on, then quite possibly the blackout wouldn't have happened. But they started to trip off, and that caused enough of a frequency deviation then that the system did go outside its operating parameters, at which point the conventional generation tripped off as well. And that wasn't a violation. There's a point at which you can't expect people to ride through faults that are bigger than than their equipment can tolerate. And so once you'd had enough of those renewables tripping off, you really were in a situation where it was going to be impossible to maintain the grid.
So one of the conceits of the 100% renewable grid lobby is that you increase energy security by having distributed sources of energy that are far more diverse than large generators using conventional means like nuclear and fossil fuels. And this would appear to suggest the opposite is true.
No, so I've written another blog more recently about whether we could run a large-scale grid on direct current instead of alternating current. And the conclusion really is no, the technology to do that doesn't exist. So trying to use inverter-based technologies on an alternating current grid is like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. There are limits to how far you can take that, and in Iberia they exceeded those limits. And certainly if your inverter-based assets are not complying with grid codes, then you'll reach those limits faster. So you can't take that to infinity. You have to have spinning mass on your grid. Now, you might be able to have non-generating spinning mass like flywheels or synchronous condensers down the line, but the problem with that is that you don't have anything then that's actually setting up the stable waveform in the first place. And I'm not convinced that's going to work from a physics perspective. The truth is that nobody knows. This isn't an area that's been studied. I haven't seen any academic papers on this. The system operators haven't really been putting out any studies on this either, partly I think because they want to perpetuate this narrative that it's all possible and, cheerleading for net zero. And I think that's a huge problem because we want our system operators to be independent. We want them to be honest brokers in this, and they're really not being. They're too caught up in the virtue signalling around net zero. And 11 people in Iberia lost their lives as a result of this. We see it with NESO as well. NESO put out its, supposedly independent advice on Clean Power 2030. Mm-hmm. Now, Freedom of Information requests have uncovered that this supposedly independent advice was actually signed off by DESNZ and Ofgem before it was published. So it was very far from being independent. And I would suggest that people need to stop describing it as such because it's frankly untrue. But nevertheless, they said, and if you listen to Finton's Lai, who is chief executive of NESO, he'll say, yes, we've shown that Clean Power 2030 is possible. Well, pigs flying is possible. There's a non-zero probability that pigs will fly. Doesn't make it likely. And if you read the report, yes, it says it's possible, but then it lists a whole range of criteria which are really unlikely to be met. We'd need to invest in twice as much grid infrastructure in the next 5 years that we did in the previous 10. Okay, it's hypothetically possible, but very unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an economist's point of view, the public choice incentives for independent regulators that depend on their well-being and livelihood of the approval of the minister is likely to mean that they will bend towards the governing ideology of the day. And I would hesitate to suggest that NESO was any different to any others on that point. It's incredibly difficult to maintain actual independence when you're effectively 100% owned by the government.
Well, I think that's true, but I'm not seeing any evidence of them trying. And I think that's the problem. If you look at things like the future energy scenarios, in the preamble in recent years, NESO says things about they're driving the energy transition. But it's not their job to drive the energy transition. It's their job not to be a barrier to the energy transition, but it's not their job to drive it. And so I think this confusion around their role and their desire to please their paymasters is really translating into unsafe practices. Now, for example, they've just asked Ofgem to allow them to reduce their minimum inertia holding and to use batteries as the main source of inertia. Now, the batteries is dangerous if they're not complying with their grid code obligations, which currently nobody's monitoring. But we've seen in Spain what happens when that occurs. And anecdotally, we have the same problems here in Britain with battery code compliance. But also, the report that NESO wrote, which it relies on for this request, had average inertia levels during the day and showed that at no time had it gone below the minimum. But if you look at it on a settlement period basis, over 15% of the time it's going below the minimum. So my challenge to NESO would be, don't be asking for the minimum to be dropped until you're actually meeting the minimum better at the moment. And secondly, don't be asking for it to be dropped until you can measure inertia in real time with any degree of confidence, because at the moment they can't do that either. And the main way that they intuit what inertia might be is from the SCADA data of conventional generators. Well, guess what? If you're going to reduce the amounts of conventional generation, you'll have less idea of what your inertia is. So this is quite a risky prospect.
So how likely is it that the UK will experience a similar event?
So I actually think the main drivers of a blackout in Britain will be different. Excuse me. So you don't just have this issue of stability. And yes, we have problems with that. We have unexplained oscillations. We see this. Frequency goes a bit nuts sometimes. I did want to do some analysis of this around the second bank holiday in May, was somewhat thwarted by the fact that NESO had put out junk data for some of that period. There's literally zeros in the frequency data. That would mean we'd had blackouts, which we didn't. So again, why are the system data so junk? Preventing proper analysis of this. But nevertheless, we do know from the data that we can see that there are some funny things going on that shouldn't be going on. And obviously that's a threat to stability. But our, I think, bigger problem is the more macro problem is simply not having enough generation. We almost had a blackout in January because of not enough generation. And this is not, I've been warning about blackouts potentially happening, but didn't think they'd be happening so soon. Now, we had certain assets unavailable in January, which probably made that a bit more critical than it would have been. NESO is also quite bad at demand forecasting. After that event on the 8th of January, they implemented an audit of their demand forecasting and admitted they hadn't looked at it in, quote, 10 to 20 years. Well, 20 years effectively takes us back to the start of NETA in 2001. And I suspect that is... No, that was the new electricity trading arrangements. So I think that was effectively when they last looked at it. And when you look at the grid code where it describes demand forecasting, there's a lot of stuff missing that really should be there. Then that comes to another problem, which is it's actually nobody's job to monitor the codes to make sure they remain fit for purpose. Back in 2001, when they were first written, obviously they were written in a way that they would guarantee system security, but the grid has changed so much in the intervening years. And so who's checking that it's still going to give us system security? If everybody met their code obligations, would we have a secure system? And actually the answer to that is probably not, but it's not anybody's job to make sure that it is. So that's a huge problem. But so if you can't forecast demand accurately, then how can you make sure you have enough generation available? And if you don't have enough generation available, your frequency will fall and you'll fall outside the operating parameters. And we're running out of generation. We have most of the nuclear fleet due to close this decade. We have a third of the gas fleet. So this is something that nobody talks about. NESO keeps saying that we need to keep all of our gas fleets. We've got to have it in reserve when it's not windy and sunny. But a third of those assets were built in the 1990s. CCGTs typically have a 25-year life. Now, most of those 90s built plants had significant upgrades in the 2000s that would push them more towards 30 years. But right now, if you wanted to order a new gas turbine, it's an 8-year lead time. It's probably around a 5-year lead time for a new rotor. So if you wanted to re-rotor your existing plant, you'd have to wait 5 years to get the kit. And it's about 18 months for the components for a major maintenance. So if you think about...
And to be clear, this isn't just, as with most forms of power, due to over-regulation. This is actually supply chain constraints.
This is supply chain constraints, yeah. Then you look at, on the renewable side, the lead time for new big transformers is about 4 years. So a lot of the use of some of the wind farms that we have is constrained because of lack of grid infrastructure. We've got assets like Seagreen, which opened in October 2023. In 2024, they were curtailed off 2/3 of the time. So of their potential generation in 2024, 2/3 of it was actually turned off.
So not a solution.
Massive waste of money. And yes, not a solution. So we can have periods. So wind output across Europe has been lower this year. In Britain, year on year, it's down 6%. Our imports are down 10% because our European neighbours are lacking both wind and hydro. In fact, Norway's hydro levels are now approaching 20-year lows in the south of the country. And they've actually amended their Energy Act twice in recent years to give themselves the power to restrict electricity exports if their hydro levels start getting tight. They have parliamentary elections in 2 weeks' time, and a lot of the parties there have become quite negative on interconnection. Some of them even want to cancel the existing deals, so cancel the interconnector with Britain.
So, I've been following the progress of the Progress Party, isn't it? The populists.
So the Progress Party and the Centre Party both want to renegotiate the interconnectors.
The initial backlash against the collapse of the governing coalition, which did relate to this issue, saw the popularity of the conventional technocratic centre-left party rise, but that started to fall again, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens with the election. I'm not necessarily expecting them to start curtailing exports this side of the election. The hydro levels are still above 20-year lows, although they're heading in that direction. And based on the level of snow melt and the expected weather forecast, it's quite possible. People were saying earlier in the summer that 25-year lows was not unrealistic. So, you can definitely see a prospect of that happening, of them curtailing the exports for periods this year. And then depending on who wins the election or what sort of coalitions are formed, then yes, they might just cancel the deal. And of course, they've got so much wealth in the sovereign wealth fund that they could just pay to cancel the deal. They'll just say, we're not going to export electricity to you anymore, have some money. End of.
Mostly affects us and Germany, doesn't it?
Correct, yes. But the Skagerrak interconnectors with Denmark are coming to the end of their lives, I think, next year. And I think it's now sort of widely accepted that they won't be renewed. Essentially, the official position from the Labour Party, which is the current ruling party, is that Statnett can put forward a proposal, but it doesn't appear that anybody other than the Conservatives would be minded to approve such a proposal. And certainly this is quite a hot button topic for the general public. If we went outside and asked people on the streets in Westminster what they thought about electricity interconnection, they would think we were a bit nuts. But if you went onto the streets of Oslo and asked that question, people would have a view. This is something that's caused quite, public anger. And so, yes, I don't think they would tolerate a situation where the hydro levels went down to 25-year lows and they were still exporting electricity to us.
Lest anybody thinks this is something of a segue from a problem originating in the Iberian Peninsula, it was the case in this very literally interconnected world that during that incident, Greenland or parts of Greenland lost access to their mobile phone service because of a single unit on Gran Canaria, which was linked to the Iberian mainland. So the effects of these things going wrong can be entirely unexpected. And the political effects, look at the Norwegian situation, even more so.
Yes, and we've also... So Norway, I think, is almost like the canary in the coal mine here, because the Norwegians are actually very proper people who like to do things in a proper and legal way. And so they're not randomly thinking of cutting exports on an ad hoc basis. But what we hear informally in the market around the messaging from other system operators is, we're going to take care of ourselves first, and if we have shortages, there's not a hope that we'll export. And so I think Norway is just far more upfront about its intentions than other countries are. And of course, with so many countries in the same small region relying on wind as their main transition asset, and we can all share low wind conditions at the same time, the only people not doing that are Norway and France. So obviously, if Norway's running out of water, they're going to potentially not do it. And the French are relying on an ageing nuclear fleet. Twice in 6 years, they had to take large parts of the fleet offline because of systemic problems. And the French regulator has warned that this is likely to happen again, that there'll be some age-related issues that affect a big chunk of the fleet. And they only have sort of a handful of different reactor technologies. So once they identify an issue in one reactor, they have to look at all the other reactors in that family to make sure it's not sharing the same problem. And most of the time to do that, you have to take it out of service.
So going back to the question that was asked some time ago, the risk of this stuff being a problem not just for the UK, but also for other European countries as well, is, in your view, very high.
Yes, it is. I think we've been far too complacent about investing in our legacy infrastructure. And the other thing is actually in the wires and transformers and things as well. We had a huge, the North Hyde blackout or fire that took out Heathrow Airport earlier in the year. That was caused by a transformer failure. Now, it turns out that a third of our transformers were built in the 1970s. So there was actually a huge spike of grid investments in Britain in the 1970s. Half of our power lines were built then, although power lines last a long time, so that's not a particular problem. A third of our transformers and 30% of our switchgear. So the real question is, well, what's the replacement plan for these assets? And if you look at the price control for our networks, Ofgem has consistently prioritised connections-related investment above legacy investment, replacement of legacy assets. And so I've said to Ofgem, well, okay, what's going on with this? Because they will, if you take National Grid's price determination in the round that's just coming to an end and in the new one, I didn't look at the first one. Mm-hmm. You see that most of their investment ask for connections-related capex was granted, but large parts of the non-connections-related capex was declined. And it declined for a range of reasons, but some of it was things like, oh, well, none of your projects were below benchmark. And I mean, was that really a good reason for declining?
It does sound a bit like the same transport policy where we end up with shiny political projects like HS2, or we don't if the bat tunnels cost too much. But the roads are full of potholes. So everything's neglected.
So the question is, why is this happening? Is it because National Grid is not prioritising the less exciting legacy projects internally, and so they don't have the best staff, and so the business cases are weaker? Is it because Ofgem, and is that also because Ofgem has very clearly signalled its priority is around connections? Now, Ofgem says it has never told anybody to deprioritise legacy investment, but it is pretty clear from Ofgem's messaging and from the things Ofgem says that connections are a huge priority. If you do a word search for connections on the Ofgem website versus regular assets, you'll see that it's sort of many times higher than the way that they describe that.
I'm conscious we've gone almost into a second podcast. So just to wrap up the Iberian issue, it was caused initially by a failure in a renewable asset, but that wasn't the whole picture.
Well, it was caused by widespread failures of renewable assets, because you had the initial inverter malfunction that created the disturbance, and then you had the lack of grid compliance of renewables that then actually pushed the frequency outside of its operational limits. Now, yes, conventional assets as well as renewable assets were both failing when it came to reactive power obligations, but actually it was the non-compliance on the frequency side together with this initial inverter failure that really were there.
And the systemic risk was caused by an inattention to the possibility of this being a problem, by the way that the policy of energy deployment in Spain had been working to that point.
Well, yes, but it's not just in Spain.
It's across Europe.
It's across Europe. And so France and Norway are going to not have the same issues because their zero carbon generation is essentially all synchronous and conventional in nature. But anyone that's putting in a lot of weather-based renewables and really starting to rely on that without really understanding voltage behaviour and without monitoring grid code compliance. So I think this is really one of the most important lessons they should be taking away from this, is that you, in a conventional grid where you've got synchronous generation, it's not just that you have these big heavy lumps of machinery, they're also big and generating, each one generates a lot of electricity. When you're moving down to renewables and some of it's distributed, you have a lot more smaller assets all over the place. So now you need to monitor a lot more bits of kit. And they're just not doing it. Even with the big legacy assets, they're not monitoring the kit. But there's, I suppose, less scope for failure and chaos with those. But with these electronic devices, there's far more scope. And there really needs to be a proper monitoring program implemented. And in my view, we should have on at least something like a 5-yearly cycle, live on connection failure testing for all assets that are versus transmission connected. Now, obviously, there's some risk of doing that, and you need to have some isolation set up around it, but it's possible to do it, and to make sure that your grid is functioning the way that you want it to function and expect it to function, because otherwise there will just be chaos.
So on that slightly ominous note, thank you very much, Kathryn. If you'd like to find out more about what Kathryn has written on this topic, and indeed any of the other topics written, do have a look at the What's Logic blog. Also at her YouTube channel, where she explains some of these concepts in more detail and the underlying physics of electricity in particular. If you're more interested in the wider work of the IEA, then please do subscribe to the IEA Substack. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next Free the Power podcast.